Gaming journalists are the laughing stock of the internet, and now Kotaku is trying to use Immortals of Avium, a terrible game release from last year, as an example of why it's a grim time for single-player games and they are getting absolutely destroyed over it. I have a few things to show off, but before we get into the topic, if you enjoy the content I create, check out the links in the description, follow me on social media, and consider supporting through Patreon or via YouTube membership. So they put up an entire article about this, a terrible article, may I add, saying Immortals of Avium proves it's a grim time for single-player games. Right off the bat, I think it is important to establish that this game was awful. The characters were very cringy, a lot of the dialogue was bad, the combat was honestly pretty generic, it wasn't anything great, it wasn't anything awful. And the level design was bizarrely linear, even though that's not how they ever marketed the game. It just was not a good game overall. And now, instead of admitting that it was a bad game, of course, we've seen several reports over the past few days saying, EA reportedly invested $125 million into making a new single-player IP with zero microtransactions, no grind, a shorter runtime. And guess what? No one bought it. No one bought it because it was just a bad game. Congratulations, you made a single player game with no microtransactions, grind, a shorter runtime, and those things are great, don't get me wrong, but a game still has to be good in order for it to sell. And now the media is kind of trying to damage control. And they're also throwing single-player games in totality under the bus. It says in 2024, AAA games are often built around the idea of continuous revenue streams with microtransactions and live service elements. Perhaps it's corporate delusion that makes leadership think a needlessly large budget makes for a better game, but making adequate money back on a big budget blockbuster to satisfy the shareholders is becoming more difficult. Immortals of Avium developer Ascendant Studio, whose staff included veterans from studios like EA, Sledgehammer, and Telltale, made its debut with its magic-based single-player shooter last year. Shortly after, the team laid around half of its workforce off due to poor sales, and it sounds like the fallout has given the team a more dire outlook on the state of the AAA market. Now, they are trying to say this one failure, this one awful game's disaster is proof that the entire industry is in a bad place, and single-player games in totality are not going to go anywhere, and it's a grim time for single-player games when that is not the truth at all whatsoever, okay? This is a list of the top 20 best-selling games of 2023 in the US, and about half of them are single players. Let's just go through them. Titles like Final Fantasy XVI, Dead Island 2, Resident Evil 4, Super Mario Bros. Wonder. You have other things like Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which, by the way, is actually EA, and this further dispels Kotaku's narrative because EA has this single-player game on the top 10 list for 2023, and Star Wars Jedi Survivor, while it was very good, Fallen Order was even better, and when that came out a few years ago, that sold great as well. And so they used an EA game as an example of the way single-player games are dying when this proves otherwise. But you also have several other games like The Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom, Marvel's Spider-Man 2, Hogwarts Legacy. Also, it did not make the list, but it is important to note Baldur's Gate 3 also sold extremely well. So we are talking about tons of single-player games that have sold well over the past, year. Never mind going back even further years and years and years ago, how there are still games that are doing fantastic. I mean, hell, Elden Ring made this list, and it was a game that was a year old at that point. Now we're coming up on its second anniversary, and I bet it is still selling extremely well. And I'm not even the biggest conspiracy theorist here, but we all know these journalists have been in many ways an arm of the big industry players themselves. We've been fighting that fact since the days of Gamergate, so one could look at this attack on single-player games and see it's clearly an attempt to prime us for the massive amount of live service games that these companies want to push because all of the money they stand to gain from them. There was just recently a report that came out that said 95% of studios are working on or aim to release a live service game. In the survey of 537 game studios, live ops development teams want faster content releases. So this journalist's literally writing this article to also say that the players, in another way, get ready for single-player games to disappear because you're gonna have to deal with live service games the rest of your life if you want to play games in general. This idea of single-player games being dead is a complete lie predicated on the fact that the EAs and Blizzards want everything to be live service since it's significantly easier to update cash shops or push microtransactions, and it shows these journalists have no shame. They're most likely getting paid to write these articles by big industry players, and yes, I get it, it's just a theory, but it sure looks suspicious to me. Yes, Immortals of Aveum did fail. Immortals of Aveum did do terribly, but at the end of the day, they took a risk and it simply didn't pay off. It's like if they based their attitude of the direction of the industry on Forspoken or the Saints Row reboot. Yes, they were all big failures, but they didn't define the future of the industry. Yes, this article points out how people got fired over Immortals, but at the end of 2022, Saints Row reboot came out, which cost over $100 million, and an entire development studio, Volition, that's been around for 30 years was disbanded because of the Saints Row reboot's failure of epic proportions. So there are even, bigger situations, more dramatic situations that the media didn't cover, but this is where they draw the line. This is where they say enough is enough. This is a grim tale for the state of single-player games and we need to write an article. Yes, okay, EA lost money on this game, plain and simple. It was impossible to recoup the $125 million development costs, but EA has a lot of other single-player games that have made money, and just like with the movie studio, they'll release X amount of, movies a year. Some will flop, some will make tons of money, and that's just the way these entertainment industries work. Sure, there's been layoffs for various reasons, and if you're part of a development team that made a game that didn't do well, you're going to get laid off, just like if a director or a producer makes a movie, and it does not do good, or maybe they, shoved certain elements into the movie that were not really greenlit, or they tried to sneak certain elements in. They're not going to get rehired by that studio for the franchise unless you're Disney. Then you don't care and you just keep losing so much money, but you've quadrupled down too much to go back now. And with Immortals, they'll just never create a sequel. It's as simple as that. EA is a net positive company because in 2023 they reported a GAAP net revenue of $7.4 billion for the fiscal year, where Disney's was $2.35 billion, and they lost over $1 billion at the box office alone, never mind their other ventures like Disney Plus. But just because developers that worked on this game that got fired because it bombed clearly isn't an indicator of the industry overall's failure when you look at the top 20 list. Like Elden Ring, again, was one of the top selling games of 2023, but it was already over a year old. A single player game still topping the charts is fantastic for From Software and the industry in totality, but of course they wanted to push this narrative like they do time and time again, and they are getting absolutely destroyed for it. It is hilarious to see how much they're getting destroyed. Immortals of Aveum didn't sell well due to a crowded release schedule. That also is a problem. Don't blame the game, blame the time of release. I also do think you should be blaming the game partially because it was just a very bad game overall. I did play it, I gave it a chance, and I was relatively interested judging by, the combat system, but it just was not good. It's a grim time for bad games. Yeah, this is what it boils down to, is it is a bad time for bad games because people are becoming much more aware of tricks that studios are pulling with certain marketing material. People are also becoming extremely wary when it comes to the content that the game is actually going to feature. If it is going to be, let's be honest, woke or not, people are catching on, and the studios do not like that, and they are, releasing tons of products that for us, we're not going to support and we're not very interested in. Just because they put it out and it fails does not mean the whole industry is abysmal right now. Well, that's just false, but this is Kotaku speaking with their nonsense as usual. No, it doesn't. It proves that you don't release a certain new game like this right after a massively hyped AAA giant of a game just released Baldur's Gate 3. Yeah, I mean, Baldur's Gate 3 definitely did, around that time, become the talk of the town. It became the highlight of the gaming industry, and people still talk about it today because so many people do like it. But I think that you could release against something like Baldur's Gate 3 and still do relatively well, but it also has to be an extremely awesome product, and that's just not what Immortals of Avium was. It is hilarious to see Kotaku get roasted. I mean, none of us really like or trust video game activists at this point, but it's always hilarious to see them get absolutely roasted and for them to post the worst types of articles possible. But that's all that I really had to discuss in this video. Let everyone know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this, give it a like, and if you didn't, give it a dislike. I appreciate your support either way, but I will talk to you all again in the next video really soon.